Good evening, everyone. Welcome to New York City Ethereum enthusiasts. It's very thankful tonight to be at Microsoft. This is York Rhodes from Microsoft. He'll be going through the presentation. Let's just give a round of applause for Microsoft for hosting this. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and actually make sure that we've got like 3 or 4 more meetups coming in the next few weeks. So I know there's a lot of people that tried to come to this one tonight. They didn't get in, although there's plenty of seats. Make sure you sign up for those other ones coming up, and we'll turn it over to York now. He's going to talk about the enterprise of Ethereum Alliance.
Anybody here? Yeah. So my name is York Rhodes from Microsoft. Welcome to our offices. We're happy to host. Within our business, we are very focused on blockchain as an interesting value proposition. And so we're looking at both public technologies and permission technologies, and in particular in our engineering team, how to add value that enhances what enterprises, which are primarily our customers, are doing with blockchain technology. And when we look at workloads that we see in our cloud, which we call Azure, the technology patterns are pretty interesting. There's a lot of technology that surrounds blockchain implementations, and anyone, including my friends at Consensus and BlockApps who have done work in this space will know that there's a lot of other technology that you have to actually connect to in order to make value out of blockchain, particularly in an enterprise context. So that's sort of where we have a core focus within our business. We are participating in the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance as a founding member because we saw a need over the last year to really drive some of the enterprise type of requirements into Ethereum as a technology. And this, among a sort of core group of people, felt like the best way to go about doing that. So as part of the board member that we had today, the board membership meeting that we had today, one of the big decisions that we made was that I would deliver this presentation. So it wasn't necessarily by my choosing, but I'm here. Any one of us could have done it, but I'm happy to be here doing it, actually. So it's a fun group of people, obviously. And by the way, this presentation is a presentation that is often given to corporates who are asking questions about Enterprise Ethereum Alliance. So part of it is an education for people who probably are not sitting in your shoes from a community perspective. So some of the things that we like to highlight is just the vibrancy of the developer ecosystem. And if you look at Microsoft's sort of entire history and DNA, it's making vibrant developer ecosystems. So this is actually a really important thing for us. We look at this number of contributors as being a very significant value proposition of why we're spending time in this particular community. So that's just lots of press from different folks who are engaged in Ethereum-based projects, whether public or private. JP Morgan actually contributed the original code base for the Enterprise Ethereum reference specification or reference implementation. It's called Quorum. And I'll show you a little bit about that as we go through the presentation. So open source and widely available is an important thing for us, as it is for the community. Widely available and open source actually has interesting connotations when you think about Microsoft's business being the cloud business. Obviously, we want people to run stuff in our cloud, but we also recognize that people will run stuff in their data center, people will run stuff in other clouds, and having something that is open source and widely available actually makes that quite possible. So that's an important aspect. Obviously, from a development productivity perspective, that's important. And we actually feel that, Kieran, you missed your BlockApps reference. The developer ecosystem, it is large because it's accessible. And that's important for us as well. And particularly in the enterprise space, people have lots of different development choices that they make in terms of the tools and things that they use. So that's pretty important. Obviously, the reason there's 30,000 developers in the community today is not because people saw some great value in enhancing pockets of the capitalist commercial entities. It's because of all the interest in what's going on in the open source public blockchain community around Ethereum. So, we have been embracing that for quite some time and continue to embrace that. And there's other obvious qualities here that some of which you're very familiar with. So one of the things that, if you've ever listened to me speak, I always look at how is blockchain similar to other patterns that we've seen in new technologies, and how is it also leveraging components of existing knowledge bases, whether it's cryptography or consensus algorithms or peer-to-peer networking and what have you. So, and those are important because if we look at anybody, particularly in an enterprise world, they can refer or they can sort of make an analog to something they understand to try to understand this new technology. It's helpful with adoption. So when we look at, I always sort of harken back to things like some of the qualities of the internet and how the internet came to be actually a protocol that's used inside corporate networks and outside of corporate networks on the internet. So TCP/IP is obviously the standard of choice by de facto measures effectively after about 1995, which was also when we launched Windows 95 and made the interesting decision to swap out the Novell stack for the TCP/IP stack as the default technology stack in the operating system. So that had something, certainly some impact on the consumer's ability to be on the internet. If you look at Ethereum as a protocol, there's a similar opportunity, right? If you stay true to the core protocol from an Ethereum perspective, even though you're doing something for enterprise, that there's an interesting opportunity in that same sort of what I'll call translation from building intranet applications in a secure environment, or what I deem secure as an enterprise security team, and then be able to take portions of that and actually make it available over time on the internet without actually having to change a whole lot. That's actually an interesting value proposition that's actually hard to find, right, in a lot of places. That is something that we see as valuable at Microsoft as well. What's been happening in this, if you looked at any implementation inside of an enterprise, people are stripping out all kinds of code and basically, doing their own forks and creating their own, custom application. And there hasn't been a lot of sort of specification or template building to get to common frameworks. That would cause over time a tremendous amount of incompatibility, certainly inside the enterprise. And potentially in the public. So the idea here was to actually get to a point where we could create enterprise specifications around Ethereum and have reference implementations that people could use, and then that would actually help to create a better and more seamless ecosystem in enterprise deployments on Ethereum that could then, in theory, move into the public. So that is actually pretty important. And then, if you think about it from an effort perspective, if everybody's doing the same thing, that's a huge waste of time, right? And if everybody's arriving at different places, even though they did the same thing, that's going to create all kinds of problems, right? So better to get in front of that quickly and actually start to drive specification and reference implementations that people could use. So it's basically an initiative that is created to do that, and it's driven by lots of interesting organizations. The hardcore sort of work on this happened leading up into the February 28th launch. Was about a 90-day sprint of hell for everyone who was involved. But it was originally concepted back at DEF CON 2, and there was a summit held in December. But that December to February 28th period was a pretty hard one, getting things like Delaware Corp, registration and such, literally 4 days before the 28th, I think it was. And then getting product into the Azure Marketplace essentially the day before launch. So we're now at a spot where we have a fairly sizable backlog of additional membership requests that are being managed by the team, and I think there's some communications going out on those. Important to note that we're not developing a product. There's no goal ever to develop a product. It's essentially a specification or a standard. Some people don't like the word standard, that's why I say specification. My company doesn't like the word standard when it's too early, for example. And it is essentially horizontal technology, general purpose. We're not building custom business applications. We're trying to set sort of a foundation that people can build on top of. Obviously, maintaining compatibility with public Ethereum is really important, and leveraging existing standards and infrastructure where applicable. So we're providing, in addition to that, lots of wiki-like or learning resources as well that will be accessible to enterprise communities. So really driving governance and standards around the protocol through the different bodies that we have, retaining compatibility. Ultimately, we do believe that the work that we're doing in Enterprise Ethereum Alliance will actually contribute into public Ethereum. So we do see it coming together at some point in time. And we're seeking to be as lean and agile as possible as you can with a somewhat sizable membership governance board, and trying to really iterate quickly and get things done quickly. There are some short-term technical objectives that are being worked on by the technical working groups, such as getting things more modular than they are today. One of the first things that they're working on is actually pluggable consensus, so that we can actually plug in different types of consensus mechanisms. And benchmarking PBFT and consensus algorithms is also something that's underway as well. When you look at most enterprise implementations, there's lots of different interesting requirements for, well, how do we do permissioning in an enterprise context with blockchain? So those are types of things that are pretty important for any scenario around technical implementation of an enterprise blockchain. So in the short term, there's been a bunch of work on legal structure, the funding, to technical improvement processes that are going on, and some core working groups that have been created to actually move these things forward. And continued sort of moving through the membership base and getting sort of through the backlog is actually pretty important. So longer term, that's what I said before, basically. Longer term, there's a goal to sort of get back into the Ethereum protocol eventually at times. So from a governance perspective, this is basically sort of consensus governance, which is always fun. And there can be different types of proposals that are put forth by members of the meeting and voted on by the board, and obviously looking at specific technical standards and individual projects and collaboration that can also be initiated between members that might include Enterprise Ethereum and might not. Right? And those are all sort of to be determined as things progress and people vote on things. Today it's and here's one of our most outspoken members of our organization, Kara. Thank you. So, typical stuff here, open source, early adopters, people who were doing the same things, very much led by a core group of, common thinkers around, trying to get to, accelerate things down the road. So if you look at who were members at launch on February 28th, you have a combination here of large enterprises, including Microsoft and Intel, and JP Morgan, who I mentioned before, contributed the Quorum Code, and Jared and his team from BNY Mellon, Credit Suisse. IC3 is a member as well, if anyone knows who IC3 is. And there's a number of other startups here as well. Vidroll is an advertising company. And then, obviously some other names that you recognize here. Lots of press. There is a antiethalliance.org website. It is what I'll call an agile version of the website. It was released quickly and will be updated. But on that, there is a place where you can actually you can sign up to get notifications, and you can also ask for membership information if you're interested. You can do that there. So that's it. I'll invite a couple folks up, I think, to take questions if you want to do some Q&A. Sound good, Michael? Yep. Okay. Joe, you want to come up? Sure. Jared, you want to come up? Okay. Anybody else want to come up that I'm missing from Enterprise Ethereum Alliance? All right, questions? Yes.
So on one of your earlier slides, you mentioned that the public Ethereum is not optimized for culprits. Can you summarize some of the concerns that culprits typically express regarding the public Ethereum, other than the typical ones such as privacy and security?
Yeah, I'm going to start running microphones around for the questions.
Yeah, the question was, I dinged Ethereum for its lack of enterprise preparedness, pretty much. What are some of the things that we're seeing from enterprise that are, requirements that are, everybody's essentially having to reinvent the wheel?
Privacy and confidentiality, permissioned access to a private network, and scalability.
No proof of work.
Transactional throughput. No proof of work. Also.
Yes, everybody basically strips out mining. Right? They have to deal with permissioning. Like, so for example, a Microsoft customer who's running Active Directory for RBAC and ACLs, it doesn't work in a blockchain context, right? You have to glue that together somehow. So that's one example.
Sorry, but could you introduce yourself so we know?
Sure.
My name's Joseph Lubin. I have a background in tech and finance, so software engineer for a long time. Also worked in the financial industry for a chunk of years. I was one of the founders of a project called Ethereum, and also founder of a company called Consensus, which builds product on public Ethereum, and often that product works nicely on private permission versions of Ethereum, many installations of which we have built for different enterprises. So we are approaching 200 people at this point, and half of our company works on product and half does enterprise and now government consulting.
My name is Jared Harmadansky. I work for BNY Mellon in our emerging business and technology group, mainly focused on blockchain. I have a technology background. For the most part, I do wishy-washy stuff like architecture and governance discussions, project management, and occasionally I'll read something technical, just enough to get myself into trouble.
He has a specialty in governance discussions.
And a sleek new haircut.
It's an attempt to salvage what's left.
Other questions?
Questions?
We're done.
Just hang on a second.
There must be some questions out there.
By the way, if you want to actually, one way you can launch this into your Azure subscription, if you have it, is to go into the Azure Marketplace, where we have a blockchain category. And in that blockchain category, we have all the products that have been essentially tagged as blockchain products that show up. And by the way, all of the open source tools and such outside of blockchain you'll also find here in the same marketplace. So we have here basically top right block apps as an example. Next to the left of that is Truffle, and then two over from that in the middle here is Quorum. So this is actually the demonstration, single VM demonstration that we did on launch day. We're actually going to be replacing this with the next iteration of this template, which actually allows you to deploy and configure multiple subscriptions if you like. So you can imagine somebody in one Azure Enterprise Cloud and somebody in another Azure Enterprise Cloud setting up a number of nodes with different purposes, and quorum actually defines specific node roles, much like almost any implementation that you see in an enterprise context, they define different node roles. So it's basically very easy to go launch this from here.
Can I ask a question on EEA?
No.
When can we first have a reference implementation of the enterprise area specification?
Complicated answer. So there are, at the protocol level, there are two major tracks of activity. One is tactical, one is long-term, holy grail, strategic. The tactical track already has significant work done. The quorum implementation by JP Morgan and the Ethereum Go team has effectively been contributed, and many members are using it for their own purposes or in collaborations within the alliance. The long-term strategic track focuses on defining the different functionalities of the Ethereum platform, putting interfaces to those functionalities. So these different functionalities can be things like the EVM, the Ethereum virtual machine, or potentially networking, or the native token, or gas dynamics, or the consensus mechanism, or signature schemes. So if all of those things are abstracted with clean interfaces written for them, then modules can be written to implement those interfaces. And we can move to a microkernel, microservices type architecture where the modules could end up just moving forward independently of one another, and we can build a wide variety of different kinds of consensus mechanism, for instance. And so you wouldn't need to move the entire monolith of code forward. This kind of architecture enables effectively what I would call one Ethereum. It's basically this notion that if you wire up a bunch of different modules and dial in certain parameters, that then can connect to the public Ethereum blockchain, or if you choose different modules and different parameters, then you can build an implementation that subserves a certain class of enterprise or private permission blockchain. The way these two tracks intersect with one another right now is that some people are working to modularize consensus, and so we will build a few different kinds of consensus algorithms, and there are already a few available already, and have that initial component sort of split off into its own module.
So one of the things you mentioned earlier on is the privacy and confidentiality. So as Vitaly mentioned in the launch, privacy and verifiability, the balance between privacy and verifiability. So any thought on when we can actually have a reference implementation which will reasonably allow people to actually take the reference implementation and create a blockchain which is private enough but verifiable enough, so that we don't have.
So two things there: one, privacy and confidentiality, and two, verifiability, right?
Yeah.
Formal verification. So with respect to privacy and confidentiality, the quorum implementation was built exactly for that. So it's got an overlay of things called transaction managers, and it enables subsets of actors on the blockchain to have encrypted transactions that only they can decrypt. A certain privileged set of actors can decrypt those things, and they can decrypt their transaction managers, decrypt those things, run them through their virtual machines, and they can see the results. Consensus for those encrypted transactions is done across all the participants in the network, but it's done on basically a hash, so nobody can read what's going on. With respect to verifiability, that's a bigger challenge, and there are a bunch of different groups around the world that are working on that, and they're there isn't a very well-formed project right now within the Alliance, but there's sort of a proto-project going on right now.
Okay. From the enterprise perspective, how is the approach different from, let's say, is Hyperledger, competing with you guys with this alliance, or is it complementary to this alliance?
So EA isn't really competitive with anything. From our perspective, there's 3,000 Ethereum developers. Why wouldn't we want them to be? Why wouldn't we want a solution that they could work on, where we can go hire those people? Oh, and as a bonus, they're economically incentivized through, I don't know what the market cap of Ether today, $1.5 billion. Yeah. So, a fairly expensive, economic incentive in the form of Ether, right? So you can go sit there, do whatever you want on your own time, and then have skills that are usable in the enterprise environment, right? As far as Turing complete blockchain technology stacks go, it's the oldest, I would argue, and certainly the longest in production. So, we would want to have access to that market, and we'd be foolish not to. I think that's one of the main factors for why we're interested in EA. But if you look at the way EA is structured, there are pieces of the organization which are not focused on just Ethereum, they're focused on broader industry issues. And that's certainly a point of collaboration with other people and other projects, whether it's R3 or Hyperledger or anything else. It's a pretty big space out there. This from the enterprise viewpoint, there's probably hundreds of billions of dollars of infrastructure, maybe even more, that is going to be worked on as we kind of move into this new world. I think being competitive at this point in time wouldn't be really, I don't think it's necessary, I don't think it's likely to happen, and I don't think it's productive. So, I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, our space is growing and maturing really quickly, but it's still very young and not well defined. It's the first inning for blockchain and really decentralized systems. And, we need many different efforts out there exploring the solution space, and we need a lot of communication, collaboration, and Hyperledger is an excellent forum for groups getting together to work on different code bases that are exploring different approaches. The Alliance was put together initially just because there were lots of different companies that were building real systems, some production systems on Ethereum, but they were all downloading Geth or other implementations and rolling their own enterprise appropriate versions. And so none of them wanted to be in the protocol business, they just wanted to build applications. And the first thing that we set out to do was create that reference client so that they wouldn't have to worry about that. It has grown in scope, so there will be many different working groups that focus on protocol level things, benchmarking, etc. But working groups are forming for the insurance industry and banking industry, and that's really exciting too. So the focus will still be to build specs and protocols, and in many cases reference implementations. But there's a technical steering committee, and that technical steering committee has pledged not to be judgmental about what those working groups do, but to
within
be
reason.
judgmental. But yeah, within reason. But to be judgmental about the proper form of how they do things.
Yeah, with respect to your modular architecture that you devised, do you anticipate, as you have interconnected chains, chains, where there's transaction that anticipate cross-currency type of transaction? Would that be something that you look at?
Do you mean like foreign exchange?
No,
Like
with respect to
interledger.
like
Okay.
Yeah, so it's not something that the Alliance is focusing on right now, but there are several interledger projects. We at Consensus have built a tool called BTC Relay, which effectively glues public Ethereum to public Bitcoin and enables a smart contract on Ethereum to serve as a simple payment verification wallet to validate transactions that happen on the Bitcoin blockchain. So you can do atomic swaps or pay for stuff on Ethereum with Bitcoin potentially. There is The Ripple company's working on interledger protocol, so that's all about just enabling tokens to move across blockchain boundaries. There's a system called Polkadot, white paper basically written by Gavin Wood, and that is also about validating transactions between blockchains. It's another system that the Tendermint guys put together called Cosmos, and that is also just about moving tokens across ledgers.
I would say that for the most part, we don't have much of an interest in cryptocurrency directly in the EA, and you know, with a number of regulated banking institutions, there are good reasons for that. I think there is a good amount of interest in interoperability between not only different ledger technologies, but legacy systems as well. Because it's not like I'm going to be able to turn off every mainframe and just like, all right, we're cutting over DLT today. So there, you know, interoperability is something we're very interested in, and kind of probably going to be, I presume, going to be looking at quite heavily.
That is the official party line, but Jared day trades Ether all day long.
I have no cryptocurrency holdings. That is true.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, if you look at, if you compare where we are in blockchain to other technology evolutions, we're really scratching the surface on what's possible. And what typically happens in a market like this is you'll have many different implementations of something that looks similar. And ultimately, there will be shakeouts that happen, and will come down to a reasonable number. If you look at, for example, the database market today, you have stream databases, you have SQL Server, you have NoSQL, and then within each of those, you have like five different versions, right? So, we're pretty early, right? And so anything that's happening where enterprise and development communities are getting excited about this technology is good for everybody.
So do you see the scalability of the underlying Ethereum protocol to be a potential bottleneck for the more of the adoption for EEA?
Just repeat the question.
Yeah. So does the scalability issues of the core Ethereum protocol present problems for EEA usage? Is that good enough?
Yeah.
So let me answer that in two ways. The first way is that public Ethereum was built in the most challenging context, the public context, and it needed very high performance consensus algorithms in order to operate in that context. When you're in a strong governance context, you can relax assumptions, you can make simplifications, you can make optimizations. I think here and at the back there, his team built the Haskell implementation of Ethereum, and I think back at the napkin indicated that 10,000 transactions per second was doable without too many optimizations. Is that too much of an exaggeration? Or?
Depends.
Will you give me 5,000 transactions per second?
In the thousands is where the VM becomes the bottleneck. The consensus algorithm is not usually the bottleneck. You can make a block with like 10,000 transactions in it, and it will get mined. It also depends on the complexity.
And you can simplify gas dynamics in certain contexts and parallelize instructions in the virtual machine. There are just so many optimizations that haven't even been looked at. So that's on the private permission blockchain front. No, there aren't really serious scalability issues. But the public blockchain itself is going to get more scalable very rapidly. It's already starting to deal with privacy and confidentiality soon. There will be a ZK snark implementation as a pre-compile. With respect to scalability, the first step will be moving from proof of work to proof of stake. So you move from a system where you have to buy expensive hardware and pay lots of money for electricity and waste lots of compute cycles to a system that is extremely efficient in terms of computation and energy, and almost certainly more secure. So instead of all those requirements, you'll basically post a security bond, your stake, and based on that, you'll be probabilistically selected to process transactions, similarly to the way that miners compete to process transactions. That'll probably win maybe 1.5 orders of magnitude in scalability. The next phase beyond that is sharding of the network. So you move, in phase 1, you move from 1 Ethereum to 80 Etheria that are all kept consistent via cryptographic receipts and Merkle proofs. And there's a POC in existence, but it's still early days trying to figure this out. My understanding is that within a shard, if all the data is local that you need, then that'll just work as fast as Ethereum. So that'll be probably running at some number of hundreds or thousands of transactions per second, potentially. Across shards, it'll be slower and more expensive because you'll be needing to retrieve information, or you'll be doing things that have to be represented via receipts that others could look up. And so just slower, more expensive. Everything's getting consistent. Right. And also just currently when you add compute resources to any blockchain system, you're increasing the security, but you're not increasing the throughput. You're just slightly reducing the throughput, actually. But now, when you get to sharding, you start adding new shards to the system, many computers to the system, and you're going to potentially get close to linear speedups in throughput. And so throughput can get infinite in that sort of context.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to jump on, can you hold your question for a minute? I just want to go back to the enterprise blockchain viewpoint. This is actually some work that was put together by one of my colleagues in Microsoft Consulting Services. And when you think about blockchain in a pure public blockchain world, you have a very blockchain-centric point of view, which you should. And a lot of stuff actually happens on-chain. Especially in Ethereum with smart contracts. In a enterprise view, there's a ton of business logic that's outside of blockchain, right, that we have to integrate with. We talked about permissioning earlier, but there's also significant pre-processing and post-processing requirements around blockchain. So when we talk to customers about sort of enterprise deployments, we sort of break it down, starting at basically ledger in the middle, pre-processing, post-processing workflows that have to happen and be consistent across those. So if you look at some of the examples, on the left side of the screen here, you see typical pre-processing and storage you'll have in a big data scenario, for example. Lots of different legacy systems and source systems that you might have to pull reference data from, for example. Then in the middle, you'll have your ledger and smart contracts type of processing. And then when you start to look at visualizations and analytics, that stuff's being pulled from chain, but not necessarily happening on chain, right? So and typically in enterprise, there's a lot of other applications that consume the data of meaningful data of a workflow. So when we boil this down into a more detailed architectural view, and I know it's hard to see, you have pretty sophisticated number of lots and lots of different systems in an enterprise context that surround this shiny new object we call blockchain. So this includes things like permissioning and integrations and workflow processing tools and machine learning and AI and visualization and big data pools and things like that. Right? So there's a lot of stuff in enterprise that is outside of pure blockchain context that we have to actually integrate well with. So a lot of the work we're trying to do is make that easier so that enterprises can more quickly adopt.
Can we get her question first?
You mentioned compatibility with public and I was wondering if how it works in the public Ethereum blockchain, if you have any effect on the
I'll say from an enterprise perspective,
Does a hard fork have any impact on enterprise Ethereum?
yeah. I'd say from an enterprise perspective, probably not. Our desire is to maintain a code base that's as close to the public Ethereum code base for obvious reasons, right? It's less maintenance. It's easier for us. We can kind of get the kind of mind share of the entire Ethereum community and, you know, have them help towards maintain, you know, these common use, the common pieces. And by the way, we don't view this as a one-way street. We're hoping that we'll be producing output that is useful to the public Ethereum community as well. You know, we're looking to be cooperative here, not parasitic. But you know, from an operational standpoint, it's probably going to be a very long time coming, if ever, where you see a significant use case of an enterprise system hooked into the public chain, for a number of reasons, including governance issues, which you know, large enterprises and GSIFIs and heavily regulated entities aren't comfortable with ambiguous governance. So, you know, whatever we build, there's going to be clear legal governance around it, clear participation rules. There'll be legal agreements tied to any code that's executed, and kind of clear understanding of what jurisdiction that's going to be and how it gets resolved and adjudicated. Because of the lack of kind of structured governance around the public Ethereum chain, I don't see really many cases where there's going to be a huge overlap between what we do in enterprise and what's being done in public, at least in the immediate future.
Yeah, that's definitely true in your industry, but in the energy industry, for instance, we're working with one of the biggest energy companies in the world, and yeah, there is a use case on the public blockchain. So there's nothing technically wrong with hard forks. Many would argue that there's something wrong with using a hard fork to fix an application level problem, and I would agree with that in pretty much all cases. But Ethereum is let's look at Bitcoin. Bitcoin is an experimented monetary theory. It's becoming a money system. You don't want that thing to move too much. You don't want the rules on your money system to change too much. But Ethereum, right from the start, was conceived as a platform for decentralized applications, a software platform, and as software platforms don't continue to improve, nobody will care about them. So Ethereum needs to keep evolving, and it'll do that through hard forks. It is very likely that you won't have both forks exist beyond that moment of the hard forking in the future, but it could happen, and that's not a terrible thing. It could mean that some part of the community wants a system to operate a certain way, some part wants the system to operate a different way. As we move towards that more modularized microkernel, microservices architecture, there will be far less need to hard fork, because there will be this tiny kernel, and ideally it won't have to change much or ever, and then all the other elements will be more soft swappable.
Yeah, along with that, you mentioned the governance that learning what is it majority, or what level of consensus do you have to reach for this to be adopted or standard to be adopted?
Depends on what part.
So
If there's like a kind of an even split, then what happens?
what's defined as consensus in the governance board? Is that the question? It's a supermajority unless something else happens.
Yeah, there are two main levels. There's the board level, and the board has committed to stay out of the way as much as possible. The idea was to push as much power and activity into the different working groups and to give them as much autonomy as possible. So a working group can pretty much organize itself, and as I said before, the technical steering committee will make sure that the topic of the working group is not too ridiculous, and that the working group is accomplishing its work in good form. So it's focusing on specs and protocols. If it's writing a reference implementation, it's putting together a test suite, etc., those sorts of things. But it's probably not for the technical steering group to decide what the what is appropriate for the fish industry to do.
So, and supermajority is what percentage?
That was a joke.
Yeah, so, I mean, from a legal standpoint, like the legal governance of the nonprofit organization, the deciding authority is the board, and the board basically, I think, with the exception of a certain number of specific instances, it's a majority vote of the board members. The organizational governance, which still has yet to be adopted by the board, not a sore point at all, but you know, the idea is that you're going to have these working groups that form, and the people who are in the working groups are going to be the ones that basically have a say. To date, there's been no decision that's occurred that hasn't come to pretty much uniform consensus where people say, okay, we think this is the correct answer. There is this delineation between members and non-members, right? So non-members can contribute to the open source code part of this, which, right, it's an open source project, so that's cool. You know, members can contribute to the working groups and kind of get involved in a little bit more of the organizational governance. You know, if there's a banking industry group and we're sitting there talking and, you know, I don't know, York comes into a meeting and he's like, you know what, everything has to run on Azure, right? We'll probably say, go away, York. You know, like that's not going in our spec or in our white paper, right? You know, if we come in and you know, York comes in and says, hey, look, you know, this isn't, you know, computationally feasible for some reason, or this is a really bad architecture for solving this business problem, that's a different conversation. So it's all kind of very merit-based, and it's very collegial. You know, no one's, I mean, maybe it's naive, maybe it's just because it's early stage, but so far we haven't come to a point of contention. Generally, all of these working groups will have some sort of chair who doesn't really have authority, but more of kind of an organizational role, kind of keeping things on track. And if there really ever does come a bitter dispute, it goes up to the board to decide. But, you know, honestly, if like the members of the banking consortium, the banking working group, the insurance working group are like at each other's throats, that's just probably not going to happen because like as part of an industry we have to work together on technical issues, which I'm sure is what's probably more interesting to all of you. You know, I think technical merit rules the day, but our principle is to be more towards enterprise needs versus kind of anything else, right? Like we have public Ethereum, which solves the public Ethereum's needs. This is created to solve essentially an issue for enterprises. So, you know, and we've had this conversation when we talked about things. We said, look, this will not fly for us as, you know, us being big industries, big enterprises. And people said, okay, that's fair. So, fortunately, right now, it hasn't really ever gotten to a, you know, anything particularly bitter or strenuous.
How do you think about adoption targets for the EDA, and are there enterprises that you're talking to that for some reason or another don't want to participate, and if so, why do they not want to participate?
There's no reason for us to twist anybody's arm if they don't want to come and play on Ethereum. They can do whatever they want. There were 28 member companies at launch, and we'll be onboarding our wait list of 200 over the next 2 or 3 months, something like that.
Yeah, and there's also
verticals.
There's a difference also between you know, using a reference specification like Quorum, for example, versus actually being actively involved as well, right? I mean, these are, you know, open source projects, so anybody can use them.
And also, you know, sometimes it's time, right? You know, even large enterprises I know have, you know, can have relatively small groups of people working in them on this particular area, and they say, well, you know, look, we just can't meaningfully contribute at this point in time. Or, you know, what does participation mean, right? If I have a lawyer who comes in who gives me, you know, really interesting perspective on how, you know, legal documents are going to be reviewed in you know, common law jurisdictions or something, then, you know, that like 1 hour conversation can actually be immensely useful. So I mean, I think what is participation is kind of, you know, not to be pedantic, but it's somewhat ambiguous because there's such a broad number of issues that need to be addressed, and some of them, in fact, I'd say even many of them, completely not technical in nature. Their business logic, their procedural, their legal and regulatory questions. And so you could see people who maybe want to participate but aren't necessarily interested in Ethereum.
And we've tried to keep the barrier to entry as low as possible. So even for the biggest organizations, they only need to pay $25,000. There's no requirement to contribute developer resources or even participate. But the idea is that whatever you're interested in, you join if it exists already. If it doesn't exist, you create it, and you try to bring other interested parties in with you and figure out how to put specs together and maybe figure out how to draw resources to build reference implementations. It's going to be, I think, it is an enterprise-driven organization, but there are a whole bunch of startups in there too who are eager to help build things.
Vanessa, did we miss anything? Are there any companies we've talked to that just
Yeah,
like...
maybe it would be interesting to speak about the different sectors and how diverse the geography of the members there is.
Apparently there are lots of sectors.
And very diverse geographies.
So,
Introduce yourself.
I'm Vanessa. I work at Consensus with Joe, especially on Enterprise Ethereum. And I've been having a lot of calls with the new members who want to join. And we have about 1/3 based in the US, 1/3 based in Europe, and 1/3 based in Asia. The sectors are really diverse. We have a lot of people from the financial sectors, but also manufacturing, anything related to, for example, insurance, automotive, healthcare. All these companies want to build specific working groups to tackle specific problems in their verticals. So that's why we think that in the future, this idea of being a member-led organization and self-organized will be very successful because they identify their issues and we can sort of support them with the foundation, with the structure, and and just helping them build applications based on their needs.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah, I just want to know which use cases you guys are most excited about personally.
Use cases. Speaking for myself and not any employer, past, present, friend, or associate, enemy, etc. I'm very interested in identity, and I'm also very interested in the related issue, which is the issue of identity with payments. And I think we're getting to a point where there's some interesting conversations which aren't technical about what it is you want. I think that having payment systems that have no ability to have anonymous transfers of value are inherently problematic from a civil liberties perspective. I hope and I think that we'll see a digital, cash ecosystem where private transactions can remain private transactions, and institutional transactions, those $10,000 transfers that you always read about whenever you go into the airport and you check off your customs forms, would be reported under kind of institutional guidelines. But we're getting to a point where you can track every single transaction and link that to a person and what they bought. And so, I think there's a lot of questions around that, and this leads into my interest in identity, which is, Consensus has a project called Uport. There's a company called Cambridge Blockchain. There are a bunch of people that are looking at this idea of self-sovereign identity, where you control what information about yourself is shared. And an example, I was speaking with Reuven yesterday. He was a guy who works for Joe, super nice guy. Anyway, total aside. But we were talking. We were talking about an example where you go and you buy something from a store, right? And so the store knows that you're able to pay, all right? And they send a transaction to your credit card company, and your credit card company knows that you've authorized this payment, but they don't know what it's for. So the company you purchased this for has no idea who you are, okay? But they know that you have a credit card account, you're legally allowed to transact. You're not, you've been KYC, AML, if you're familiar with banking terms, know your customer anti-money laundering requirements, right? I'm not a terrorist, I'm not on an OFAC list or a sanction list, okay? So they know they can transact with me legally. They are going to get paid, but they don't know who I am. At the same time, they can send, information to a shipper, FedEx, that has my address, and so FedEx doesn't know what the item is, and the seller doesn't know where they're shipping it. They're just, they put it in a box. There's something that's on there, gets scanned by the FedEx guy, and it goes into their systems, and it starts routing it appropriately, and ends up at my door. and people don't need to know who I am, where I live, what my home address is. And to me, that's a really cool and exciting area, because if you think about the amount of information that you can get because of what you have to do with your identity. You know, someone I know said, you know, when their daughter goes to a club, they don't want like the bouncer to know where she lives. You know, the question is like, you know, is she 18 to get to the club, or you know, the bartender, is she 21? Like, that's the relevant information. They don't need to know, oh, she lives at this address, right? You know, and that was, you know, that was another example that someone gave. So I do think there are real practical problems that technology can help make better, and it's up to us to make sure we don't screw it up.
Early on at Consensus, we realized, as Jared did, that identity is foundational for both our products as well as our enterprise consulting work. So we built Uport to be a self-sovereign identity construct on public blockchain. For the first time in history, we have this shared permissionless global resource that is appropriate for global identity, where I would argue that having a centralized database for global identity is an extremely dangerous thing to do. And so we built Uport. It is a container for reputational attributes, so you can upload your state-issued ID. You can link this blockchain-based identity, which enables you to log into decentralized applications or applications without perhaps username and password. And it also enables you to, or we have a construct that enables you to anchor that in the legacy system, so you can have legacy identity providers like a bank or a government agency lodge a cryptographic attestation on your blockchain-based identity, and sort of link those two systems. So, reputational attestations are things that people, your utility company, your fellow software developers can lodge against your Uport, basically feeding back on your conduct in certain kinds of transactions or situations. And so essentially, we built identity, self-sovereign identity for the world, so that people in the developing world who don't have access to state-issued ID or banking relationships can use their social context and have attestations make them appear to be a real, potentially trustworthy person, and they can use that to sort of bootstrap themselves, enfranchise themselves in the global economy, maybe by getting a microloan or something like that. So that's exciting. The other major early killer app, perhaps, is crowdfunding or equity crowdfunding. We have this Ether token, and anybody who holds it, software developer or business developer, is incentivized to add value to the ecosystem. We have a lot of projects. We built an equity crowdfunding platform called Wayfund and a governance tool called Boardroom, and we at Consensus, and there's a token launch on the 24th for our prediction markets platform Gnosis, but we are going to run a lot of our projects through this crowdfunding platform. And what this does is it enables an enormous amount of frozen capital to be thought and applied usefully. So it's it's illegal for most people in the Western world who, if you're not accredited, basically you can't invest in projects. And so the context is global, so many more people will be able to invest in these things, and university students will be able to throw $50 at a project. Right? So huge amount of thawing of capital. On the other side, you have a ton of projects that couldn't possibly get an email back from a venture capitalist, so they can put their pitch up on the internet, connect it to a Wayfund token launch, and engage in permissionless VC. So it's going to cause tremendous growth.
So do you have any books that you want to pitch?
My Life by Joe Rubin.
I was going to say, so for my part, in terms of particularly interesting things, I came to the conclusion that identity was foundational. When you work on any project, it's sort of a critical part of any blockchain project. So we've been working on some foundational aspects of identity, working closely with Uport and others in that. So the area that's actually very interesting to me, and Joe mentioned this as well, is humanitarian identity specifically, and how self-sovereign identity can actually change someone's economic vitality in the world through these types of reputational attestations, including an economic history associated with, for example, how much corn you farm each season, right, and how much that sells for at market. Right, that becomes transactional economic history associated with, with you, right, that you can carry with you no matter where you are in the world. So that's one. It actually relates to supply chain, which is another one I think is sort of a universal thing. I see people calling, supply chain from my context is primarily in the goods movement through through a supply chain, but you can actually think about a lot of things in a supply chain context, including commodities, obviously. Advertising information is actually a supply chain, right? When you get from all of the pieces of an advertising flow is a supply chain, and people even talk about hotel room booking as a supply chain. So there's sort of a universal concept, and if we can actually get the patterns right around identity and asset registration and the flow of goods, whether digital or physical, I think we'll actually have some very significant opportunities to impact different humanitarian situations around the world.
Do you mind if I riff on that for a second?
Go ahead.
So there was a project that I became aware of with the Human Commission on Refugees, where one of the things they wanted to do was solve the fact that people who get displaced who are refugees, right, they often don't have any way of proving who they are. So the idea of being able to get, oh, sorry, did I steal your thunder, Vanessa?
No, go ahead.
Please.
No, please. I just want to make an announcement after.
Okay. Some old music that we got there. And so one of the things they were looking at is how do people keep records, like, medical records, like, what's their medical history, vaccination records, things like that, things that actually can be quite important, right? You want to go to the EU, you've never had any vaccines, that's potentially a problem. So, they're trying to create records for people, not only to unlock them in terms of their ability to interact with the world economy, which is obviously, I think, pretty important, but to allow them to kind of move from place to place and actually keep important information about them in a secure way, in a trusted way that, yeah, okay, this is in fact Joe Lubin, and he's fully vaccinated, and, he's allowed to, come to Microsoft or whatever. Pardon?
And he has a book.
Yeah. We microchipped him. Joe's on the blockchain. But, with supply chain, we're, BNY is an advisor to the IoT, I think it's called the Blockchain IoT Consortium. Our interest is that we, by law, because we're a custodian bank, we have to carry physical documents, right, physical copies of things. So the idea of being able to cryptographically link an analog object to a distributed ledger or some sort of digital record keeping in a way that is tamper evident. So right, if you rip the seal off, it will break it. You'll know that this is not actually the document I thought it was. Right, these are not the documents you're looking for. Right, that's very important for us. But one of the things that particular consortium looks at is also provenance and counterfeiting, which obviously consumer goods, right? You want your Louis Vuitton bag to be a real Louis Vuitton bag, but yeah, fine, you have a knockoff bag, maybe the stitching comes out. One of the real interesting cases is that they're looking at ways of doing provenance and counterfeiting on drugs. And I think there was a case where, I think it was GlaxoSmithKline, these truck drivers were basically like pulling over the side of the road, offloading pills, replacing them with placebos, and then selling them. Of course, it took a long time to discover there's a problem because people dropped dead 6 months later because they were taking sugar pills instead of whatever they're supposed to be taking. I think it took Interpol 2 years to catch these folks. So, I mean, there are actually real everyday problems that can have actually fairly substantial impact that I think that we can help solve. Sorry, that was kind of a total tangent.
Yeah, and to continue on that tangent, if you're interested in blockchain for social good, we just created this meetup, blockchain for social good, and you're welcome to join. We had our first meetup last month. This month we're going to do a hackathon with UN Women, and it's going to be a global hackathon to solve issues around the SDGs. And every month we'll be bringing in speakers and companies and charities that are doing amazing things on the blockchain. So you're welcome to join. I think we can advertise it on this meetup, and please join us.
That's based in Norway, but there will be different pods around the
Yeah,
world.
there will
is
be
that-
local hackathons in Berkeley, here in New York, I think even in Bangladesh at the same time. So it's going to be a pretty exciting time, and we'd love for you to contribute if you're interested.
Yeah, it was a vibrant audience. I spoke at the last one.
Yeah.
There were some people in the audience here as well. It was good. Yes?
So I'm just curious, right? Instead of creating an enterprise Ethereum, for example, right? Why can't you just build on the top of the public Ethereum? Right? You want to add these performance, security, and privacy features on the enterprise Ethereum, which don't exist in the public one, right? So if you have a system that is distributed at the internet, you don't want to have two internets, for example. Why can't you just create build applications of security?
That is exactly the idea. Enterprise Ethereum Alliance doesn't want to step on the core Ethereum work at all. In fact, we are already very collaborative and hope to be extremely collaborative and supportive of core Ethereum and the Ethereum Foundation. But it's not in the purview of the Ethereum Foundation to figure out how to create permissioned networks, to restrict access to becoming a node on the network. So there are certain things that just need to fall to a different group with different agendas to get done.
I would also say that, at least for the immediate roadmap, I think it's more of a question of prioritization. There are things that are really important for enterprises, whether it's confidentiality and privacy, whether it's public consensus, that are not as important for public Ethereum. So, I think the dream, the vision of there being kind of this one code base, and you download your wizard and you say, okay, public or private, and you get public, you get public Ethereum, private, it says, okay, how many nodes or what level of privacy you need, and you go through it and it sets everything up the way you need it. And maybe you get a config file that you send to everyone else who needs to set it up, so they can just say, select config file, and they get the same setup, and it's all compatible. And, that's a dream, right? That's a vision. I think, I think that's why. But I also think it's instructive to realize that, there were different networking protocols, and eventually we did come to consensus, as a technology on this, and I think that it's in our interest. It's in the interest of large enterprises to have, open source, well understood, well supported, highly vetted technologies with active communities around them. I think the kind of proprietary open source war has kind of been lost on the proprietary side. I think open source is kind of won. And the idea of open source code, it's what was it like if you're doing open, was it coding with Linux is coding for communists or something like back in the 90s or whatever. I saw there was a picture at the Hyperledger conference that was pretty funny. Like a red Putin, or not Putin, Lenin putting his shoulder on the programmer, his hand on the programmer's shoulders. But I don't think that's the case anymore. I think people realize that you're getting higher quality code, and from a pure economic standpoint, not only am I getting more secure code, but that's more performant and more responsive to issues. With open source projects, you're going to just get a lot more for your money, right? We want to focus on applications. We don't want to focus on building HTTP, right? We want to build things on top of that. And so one of the reasons why I think enterprises across industries have realized this. We've learned the lesson of the internet. And realized the faster that we get to an actual stable protocol that has a large level of compatibility and that's supported across multiple fronts, the sooner we can have, start integrating these things into data centers, turning off, legacy hardware, getting new technology out there, and really producing value for us. So, that's kind of a very economic article. So I think we are strongly incentivized to try and maximize, and if not, and hopefully maybe even unify in kind of one code base.
All right. Thanks everyone for their questions and for entertaining us. We're sort of at time, so.
Yeah, you got your jacket on, so I guess that's a sign.
Just wondering if the sprinklers are going to go off or something.
I know people like to network a little bit. Is there a time you want us out, to get out?
20 minutes.
15, 20 minutes, 8:30. But thank you, everyone. Thanks to our panelists. Thanks to Bjork.
Thank you.